In 1814, British forces marched into the harsh, elevated foothills of Nepal to lay siege to Kalinga Fort. They brought an immense, cumbersome footprint. The expedition required 4,400 armed soldiers, shadowed by an additional 5,000 servants and camp followers, carrying extensive personal supplies. Waiting inside the fort's immense walls was a defending garrison of exactly 250 Nepalese soldiers. This chart shows the absolute numerical disparity on the ground. Against 4,400 British troops, a garrison of 250 men faced mathematical certainty of defeat under standard military logic. An overwhelming advantage on paper often lulls an attacking force into a dangerous sense of inevitability, masking the fragile variables that dictate actual combat. The British expedition was led by General Robert Rollo Gillespie. In his written military doctrine, Gillespie instructed his men that victory favored cool and deliberate valor. The reality of his command was entirely different. Gillespie was an erratic megalomaniac, someone obsessed with power, who treated war as a drug to repair his ruined personal reputation. Gillespie divided his massive force into 4 detachments, positioning them to surround Kalinga and assault the wall simultaneously. To prevent native guides from leading men astray, he established a strict synchronization. A 10 o'clock cannon signal would coordinate a midday mass attack. The absolute perfection of this synchronized plan created a fatal vulnerability. The entire British army was now entirely dependent on the emotional stability of its commander. At dawn on the day of the attack, British artillery began bombarding the fort to soften its outer defenses. The guns performed poorly, leaving the fortifications intact. Facing the spectacle of his massive army being effectively defied by a fraction of its size, Gillespie lost control of himself. His anger escalated into humiliation. Dismissing his officers' pleas for time, he abandoned the midday schedule. At 8 o'clock, the signal cannon fired early. This premature action triggered an immediate logistical collapse. Dispersed across the surrounding hills, none of the 3 supporting columns were listening for a 10 o'clock signal at 8 in the morning. When those isolated commanders heard the confused, distant firing, they checked their watches and logically concluded it was simply part of the routine morning bombardment. Abandoning a synchronized communication schedule instantly neutralized the British numerical advantage, leaving the vanguard stranded during the assault. The men of the 53rd Regiment had marched all night over appalling terrain. Despite their exhausted condition and lack of preparation, Gillespie ordered them straight into frontline action. Ground-level failures began to compound. The heavily loaded infantry made agonizingly slow progress, and the hut housing their scaling ladders burned down, destroying their only means of climbing the walls. Without adequate support, a vanguard of 60 dismounted dragoons rushed blindly toward the fort, only to be entirely wiped out by the defenders before the British infantry could intervene. The Nepalese garrison used grapeshot, a cluster of small metal balls, to decimate the disorganized British infantry trapped near a gate, while their traditional curved knives proved highly lethal in close-quarters combat. Cursing his retreating men for cowardice, Gillespie drew his sword and launched a solitary, doomed charge toward the fort. This sequence of disasters demonstrates how emotional volatility at the command level bypasses military superiority and directly engineers fatal chaos on the front lines. Within seconds, Gillespie was shot dead. In a brutal irony of timing, the delayed support columns finally burst from the surrounding woods at the exact moment his body was carried away. Colonel Sebright Mobby immediately assumed command of the fractured army. Assessing the damage, he ordered the main force to retreat, officially conceding the assault. The historical record of this disaster survives largely through the accounts of British officers who, far from mourning, openly rejoiced at their commanding general's death. One officer documented their stark relief, writing, "It is the general opinion here that Gillespie's death has saved the army." Because of the remote location, Gillespie's body was preserved in spirits for transport. His soldiers offered a dark epitaph, words used to remember the dead, calling him a preserve when dead. We must acknowledge the inherent bias, or personal leaning, in this historical record. These primary accounts were written by men who harbored a long-standing hatred for Gillespie. Gillespie's unchecked hubris ultimately dismantled his own military logic, demonstrating that an army's numerical superiority is only as effective as the person commanding it.